Hello, it's Jess Pettitt, and we are doing Chapter 6, Department of State today. And my dear friend Craig Ruck has stupidly agreed to read this chapter and have a conversation with me about it. So, Craig, welcome. And
Thanks,
if I've
Jess.
learned anything from my cantankerous friends, it is you probably have an opinion or something. Is there something that we need to start off with immediately coming in from the Department of State? Welcome.
So I guess overall, as I read this chapter, it was not the longest chapter in this thing. Um, there wasn't anything I found terribly surprising,
Mhm.
with one exception, and I'll get to that. What is terrifying is when you read this chapter in the context of the larger document.
Mhm.
The one thing that jumped off the page at me right away, they misstate the mission of the Department of State.
Oh, that's a good catch.
The Department of State exists to implement the foreign policy of the United States and to serve U.S. citizens abroad and protect the national interest and all that stuff. They cleverly say, no, no, the mission is actually to implement the president's
Got
foreign
it.
policy.
Mhm.
To me, that's an enormous difference. And the other thing they do is they flip the national interest. They put economic interests first.
Mhm.
So, allies and all of that be damned. We're going to pursue our economic interests first, and then
Yeah,
everything else falls behind.
I honestly, I think, Craig, I think that's a great place just to start because that is a baseline through the entire document, right? So one of the sentences that I keep referencing in these conversations, largely because it's keeping me awake at night, is nonpartisan public servants that are loyal to the president's
Right,
agenda. Like
right.
that's not what that sentence means. That's not what that means. So
Well,
yes,
and I think our friends who wrote this would argue that that's an anathema to America,
which part?
that there can be loyal resistance.
Loyal resistance.
You either agree with me or you're dead wrong and you're not an American. I mean, I'm paraphrasing a lot, but that's the theme that runs through this thing.
Yeah,
And
no,
it and
that
and
I
they seek to apply it to foreign nations. You can
right.
be our ally as long as we have some economic interest. If we're going to profit from this, then you're our ally. If you aren't, screw you, you're on your own.
You have to pay your own bills. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, so let's back up a little bit because even though I thought I knew a lot about the federal government, I'm kind of obsessed with this stuff. There's a lot of these chapters that have never actually spent any brain thinking about. Now, Secretary of State is a role in the federal government that I am aware of and that I have thought about in advance. And so, in case we're following along on our bingo card, this is supposedly going to be Marco Rubio. That's the person who's being
correct.
nominated to be Secretary of State. So the Department of State, according to them, right, is you named it, is the diplomats must serve president's agenda and foreign policy vision. This includes the needs and goals of that foreign policy vision. And it does talk about political appointees and foreign and civil service employees within the Department of State. Um, and then basically from there, everything else is questionable. Taking up first the treaties and agreements, and this gets to your emphasis on the economic benefit for American interests, putting American interests first. And we have heard a little bit about this, I think, in the news, but looking at a cost benefit analysis of all global treaties and agreements, and to make sure that the United States is profiting off of
Yeah.
them,
Yeah.
that is a revolutionary move. And I will admit that in kind of doing more of a rabbit hole dive, and then I can't wait to hear what you'd say, is I don't think I'd really consciously understood that other countries, this is my opinion, and then you correct me, but other countries are not paying their bill, I'm using air quotes, but are willing to say that the United States is the world leader, right? Like, United States is in charge. United States power is that everybody owes us money because of these agreements that the fiscal side of it is not necessarily being upheld by other countries in exchange for you get to be homecoming king, is what it sounds like to me.
Well, but see, even that, so two things, and remind me if I don't to get back to the paying their bills comment.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The bigger problem is, and President-elect Trump keeps getting away with this. There's a reason that political appointees are separate from government employees. Civil service employees are nonpartisan.
And
Political
explain,
appointees are understood to be partisan. You expect them to be. That's why we have confirmation hearings and all that sort of thing.
right, the background
These
check.
folks,
Okay.
well, and I'll digress for just a second. These folks want to politicize the civil service. They're as clear as can be about that. That's throughout
Yes,
this thing. The other very devious thing, and it's certainly in chapter 6, they want to use interim appointments for those political appointments. As I understand it, and somebody else could correct me on this, if the president makes an interim appointment, he does not need congressional approval, and that interim serves until this Congress adjourns, which means 2 full years from now.
correct.
So that's their plan. Their
That's how they're
plan
planning
is
on
to
getting
totally
around.
sidestep Congress, appoint a bunch of lackeys, have the lackeys then have loyalty tests so that they can fire the civil service employees and put in people of like mind.
Mhm. There's a piece in there that I think is important to highlight right now, and that it's the use of radio silence, and that currently the Secretary of State may have the audacity to have their own voice and concerns and even serve as a mediator between other countries. And what this is really suggesting is that the only voice the Secretary of State would have is an amplification of what is in the White House.
Right. And
That's
remember,
the
they
shift that Craig's
they
talking about.
started out by misstating the mission. The mission, they say, is to implement the president's foreign policy, not the
Right.
United States foreign policy.
Correct.
Whatever Trump in his fevered dreams comes up with, we're going to invade Greenland and take it over because we like it. That
Now,
then is something the State Department would be bound to implement.
let me ask you this question because you've been on planet Earth a couple months longer than me.
Oh, thanks. That's very generous of you.
I know, I'm being generous. Watch out. When when I think about how the US is being positioned globally, right? Like if it is the number one world leader and then everybody else is subservient to it. And there are a lot of countries kind of in that middle management position, right?
Hmm.
Why would Let me ask this a different way, almost like the filibuster. So if Democrats had the majority of Congress, it often comes up of getting rid of the filibuster, which they don't do because they might need to use it someday.
Right.
If Why is that logic not being applied that if we're being loyal to the president's agenda, if we do that, like if we turn all the dials to whoever the president is, that's not good for continuity. But the next president, if they weren't a Republican and followed suit, one, isn't that like exactly what they don't want? Or are they just basing this on a premise that there will always be a Republican president? Or two, they're not thinking that far ahead because of the benefits they would get from all the dials being turned to this Republican president.
I don't know. I can't get inside conservatives' heads. Some people that some people that I have vehemently disagreed with have stood up on principle, and others, I'm surprised they've been aggressive voices on the conservative side, aggressive voices in other matters, and they just won't stand up to this. The
Mhm.
answer to your question is, I think their plan is there will always be a Republican majority.
Got
They've
it. Okay.
they've gerrymandered Congress to the point where it's almost a joke now.
Yeah. I
So
mean,
thank in one sense, thank goodness we have the filibuster.
I guess I think it's an important kind of mindset, right? Is that I've done enough of these conversations now that I really want to shine a light on what the mindset is, right? So it's not limited, I guess is the language I would use, to Trump and his agenda, which
Right.
I don't know that he has an agenda or he is the puppet to the puppet master's agenda. But if the mindset is that you will always be in power moving forward, or someone who has your agenda will be,
Right.
this this is what we would be doing. That makes a little bit more sense to me than just opting into a system that is like a pendulum swing every 4 years or at least every 8 years. That
Yeah, but
seems
so a couple
shocking.
of things. That pendulum swing, that's the way it's supposed to work. The system is designed for that. And then we move forward in the mean between those two swings. It
Mhm.
slows things down. It's messy. It would be more efficient if we didn't have those swings. But that's the way it's supposed to work.
Right.
You know,
That's how we went
you have
from
Richard Nixon followed by Jimmy Carter, followed by Ronald Reagan.
right.
You know the progression.
Thurgood
So we're
Marshall followed
always
by
going
Clarence
this
Thomas.
way, but we're moving forward. These people don't want to move forward.
Yeah,
There is you, I mean, you mentioned, I know everybody'd be shocked watching the images that I'm older than you.
I know. It's
20,
only months. It's I have a better skincare routine.
25 years ago, I think Paul Krugman, he just retired. He was the economist, um, columnist for the New York Times. In the preface to his book, can't remember the title of it, he talks about how we need to view the conservatives as a revolutionary power. That's the title of the preface.
Mhm.
And as a revolutionary power, they have no respect for, they feel no compulsion to follow or play by the rules. And those of us who are playing by the rules are going to lose if we expect them to just play by the rules. So I thought that was an interesting analysis. And here's the scary part. That came from a doctoral thesis written by Henry Kissinger when he was in graduate school, that strategy. So
This
it
is
has
a
been
long
around
game.
for 50, it's been around for my lifetime.
Yeah. Well,
There's another book, and I probably read too much of this stuff, called How to Hide an Empire.
mhm.
Can't think of who, Daniel something or another wrote that.
You can get them to me and I'll put them in the show notes.
And his argument is the United States has always been an empire and a fairly brutal one, but we've done it in subtle ways. We haven't done it the way Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine. We colonized Europe after, his argument is, we colonized Europe after World War II. It was an economic colonization. We made them we made ourselves their major market. We made them use US dollars. And we've done this consistently for over 100 years.
Mhm.
There's a reason that Alaska and Hawaii became states, but the territories of the Philippines and Puerto Rico did not. And it's purely economic. And you look at
Mhm.
some of the things we've done in South and Central America during my lifetime, supported absolutely brutal dictators. That's US empire. It's just not imperialism the way that we've always looked at imperialism as, oh, the Japanese Imperial Navy. No, we are probably one of the most virulent imperialist nations ever. We've done it subtly. What these people are saying is forget about the subtlety. We're just going
Right.
to
Put
take
put
whatever
it
we
out on the
want.
front porch.
Yeah. So
Um,
my point is, it's taken 100 years to get there, but I'm about to speak praisefully. At least this is out in the open. At least they're
right.
honest about it.
Well, that's the bonus.
They're not hypocritical anymore, you know.
I'm finding in doing this project, I'm finding a sense of hope, which I was not necessarily expecting to find out of this project.
Yeah.
But if we use what you just said, and then I'm gonna go back to pay the bills because you told me not to forget to take you
Oh,
back
yeah.
there. But if it took 100 years for this idea to get to here, it also has taken 100 years for this idea to not be mainstay, right? Like, not that I know anything about football, but there's an offense and a defense. And there's something that's working in the system that this didn't just occur in a day 100 years ago, right? And that we have the ability
Right.
to stave it off and do something that's better, possibly because of that pendulum swinging kind of thing. So, okay, pay your bills.
But just to expand on your analogy, and as you know, I know even less about sports than you do. But this is as though the liberals have been playing by the rules of the game. They've been staying within the boundaries of the field. And then the whistle was blown, fourth quarter ended, and the game was over. So the liberals went home. The conservatives stayed on the field, continued to advance the ball, continued to score touchdowns with nobody else on the field. And those of us who are of the liberal perspective have made that mistake again and again and again.
Mhm.
You know, the Vietnam War ended, we thought, that's it, good, we can go home. Civil Rights Act was passed, we thought, well, we've solved that problem, now we can go home and get on with our lives.
Yeah.
The other side never rested. They never agreed with the Civil Rights Act. They never agreed that Vietnam was a mistake. I mean, you name it. They just never relented. And we all
Right.
did because, again, back to Krugman's analysis, we don't understand they're a revolutionary power. They have no respect for the system the way it is.
Mhm.
Look at a guy like Steve Bannon. He would like nothing better than to tear everything down from, you know, the post office to signal lights at the intersection. He sees no reason for any of that to exist.
And it's all about usurping power because that's the focus, is that
Yes,
individual,
yeah,
the ego power.
yeah. And
Okay,
Trump is simply the latest iteration of that.
pay your bills. I want to make sure that we get that in, and I'm trying to
Oh,
manage time too.
yeah, this has annoyed me. The media is reporting on this. So President-elect Trump is fond of saying, "Oh, and nobody else is paying their bills. They're ripping off the United States." That's not true. My understanding is NATO in particular, it is that they are supposed to be spending a percent of their own gross domestic product on their military, on their defense. And some of them aren't doing that. Some of them are falling short. Others are spending a lot more than we do. So when he says they're not paying their bills, they're ripping us off, that's not true. That's just false. But the fact is a little more subtle and a little more complicated, and so the media doesn't explain that. It's also relative. I don't know what Finland's gross domestic product is, but safe to say a small fraction of the United States.
Less, for sure.
So if they fall short of their percentage, it's a rounding error for the US military budget. You know, so that was the point I wanted to make about that.
Perfect. I think it's an important thing to remember. And what is ultimately kind of, I think, what even fueled doing this project in the first place was I am responsible. If okay, I'm going to make some bold claims. I am a fan of democracy. If I am responsible for my role in democracy, I am responsible for the sources of where I get my information from.
Mhm.
I am responsible for continuing to click, right? Like one of my big lessons when I did the Department of Agriculture chapter, um, Abraham Lincoln started the Department of Agriculture in 1862 as a like token of appreciation to Northern farmers who were supporting Northern troops. First department chair of the Department of Agriculture was Isaac Newton. My brain explodes
Yeah,
because I'm like, I didn't even know they were contemporaries. What is going on? Keep clicking. Not Isaac Newton, Isaac
right.
Newton, a guy named Isaac Newton. Not Isaac Newton, but a guy named Isaac Newton. But I think it's such an important metaphor, right? Is that I would get so many social points that I actually did any research and then was flabbergasted that Isaac Newton and Abraham Lincoln would have been contemporaries because they weren't by like 100 years.
Right.
But if you don't click again, I already got praise for looking into it more in depth. But if I didn't click again, I wouldn't realize there was another human being named Isaac Newton, right? I'm responsible for that. And that's a really big balance because we have attention spans of gnats. And when do you know when to stop clicking? I am like an obsessive researcher. I set a timer. I have 15 minutes for this. Otherwise, I will never get out of a hole ever. Um, but that is also, I think the big lesson for me is that I'm never going to be able to know all of the information. And so I need
Right.
to be prepared to be wrong. So when I reported to a group of people that Isaac Newton was the first chair of the Department of Agriculture, and they were like, no, he wasn't. And I'm like, yes, he was. We are both correct. It's just not the same human, right?
Yeah.
And I need to be prepared to not know things. And I feel like there's almost a fragility that's showing up in Project 2025 that I'm now hearing kind of repositioned or edited in a different font from you, is that the fragility isn't their sensitivity to the existing structures, because I think I've been adding strength to the structures. I think the fragility is in the structures because they are very strong.
Well, I think that's right. And I really worry. God, I don't know why we keep coming back to our age difference. When I was
We're
in
friends
school,
and people don't have intergenerational friends.
when I was in school, I was a liberal arts major, I'll confess, mostly because I wanted to avoid being drafted to go to Vietnam, and that was the easiest broad major I could maintain my class load in.
Mm-hmm.
But I learned some skills in critical thinking, and I learned some stuff about civics. And I'm not sure that's being taught anymore. Your generation, and particularly the generations after you, I don't know if we have those critical thinking skills. It terrifies me when somebody says, I've done my research, which usually means they went to a search engine that continued to serve them up exactly what they expected to find. That's not really research. And as liberals, we're not very good at countering this. So I can give you an example. The Trump campaign ran on prices are higher than they've ever been. And the Harris campaign tried to counter that. No, no, wait. Inflation is actually at a low. It hasn't been this low in decades. And the important thing is inflation is less than wage increases.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, what the liberals were saying is absolutely correct. And what they missed is for the average person going into the store to buy eggs, they're more expensive than they've ever been.
Right.
So if
Pricing
you
is not
so if you
relevant to how
don't
much you're
think
getting
about
paid.
it, the conservatives sound reasonable because that's what you're experiencing, and the liberals sound like elitists who don't really care about the real world.
Right.
And we're just not good at saying, you know what, you're right, prices are higher than they've ever been. Let me explain to you how that happened, and let me explain to you why actually things are getting better. We
Right.
don't we don't do that. I don't know why.
There's I did a speech right after the election here in my hometown, your former town. And one of the things that I said was is that when you are in grocery outlet and you hear someone talk about how good the tariffs are going to be, no one in grocery outlet needs your TED talk on economics,
Right.
right? And you're not even an expert on tariffs. Like the condescension that has become the main way I think liberals communicate with other people is a part of the problem, and that we are so convinced that we are right. And I am not saying we are wrong, but
Yeah.
we are having two incredibly different conversations,
I
which goes
don't know
back to like following the
how
rules.
we overcome that. You know, the fires in Southern California. I don't know if you know this. I grew up in Altadena.
Mhm.
As a matter of fact, the elementary school where I attended kindergarten and the home that I lived in, that they're both burned to the ground.
Oh,
I've been
wow.
following that with some interest. The misinformation, oh, they ran out of water. No, they didn't run out of water. It turns out when you open every fire hydrant on a block, the pressure gets low.
Uh-huh.
Oh, look at that. There's a reservoir that's empty. Yes, it was a planned repair. It's been underway for months and it doesn't matter. But the picture is the empty reservoir, you know. So you take that and coupled with they insist on covering the Pacific Palisades fire because that's where the rich people live. And they're sort of ignoring the Altadena fire because that was very blue collar. And people wind up with this picture of, well, it's a bunch of rich Californians and look, they can't even keep the water running. How
Skewed.
do you counter that? Because now people are walking around and they're saying, I know this about California.
Well, so interestingly, because now we're coming back to the stuff, the skewing is what I think is really important. And if we talk about the global story about the United States being a um predetermined by the megaphone of the president's agenda,
Hmm.
which is a pretty big baseline. In a different chapter about communications, we were talking about Voices of America. And one of the things that I'm noticing between the chapters is they just move things into other departments, but that department's chapter doesn't know it's incoming.
Right. Yeah.
So Voices of America would move to the State Department, and it is used as a dogmatic propaganda, that's why it exists, is to tell
Yeah.
the story of the United States, but without US residents being the target. And because of the internet, US residents can have access to it, but they're not the target. And it was very interesting for me. I have not thought about the Voices of America that way, but if it is telling propaganda, first off, that seems very much deeply rooted in imperialism and colonialism, but they're mad about it because the propaganda that has been going out for the last 8 years, largely due to COVID, is anti the current White House administration, or during COVID, Trump's administration. Um, and you're not allowed to be critical of the president, which seems dangerous. That to not be able to be critical of authority, that's a pretty fundamental piece of democracy. But maybe I'm just being a liberal following the rules.
No, I don't think so. And, as you know, I worked in radio early in my career. Voice of America was absolutely a propaganda vehicle, but we pitched it as we're here broadcasting the truth behind the Iron Curtain. That's really where it started. It was a shortwave service.
Mhm.
And people behind the Iron Curtain lived for that information. We had a point of view. It was definitely shaded information, but that's how we positioned it. Um, I think there's a related problem that conservatives have with public radio. Public radio, they can't control that message.
Right.
So I
Same
don't,
thing with like PBS, that's under
yeah,
it.
yeah. And so why is the government feeding this information that's counter to the government's message? I don't know. It hurts me, but I think in many ways these radio issues have become obsolete because the internet is everywhere. And that's part of the problem. America was able to build an empire, a stealth empire, without being accused of imperialism because we were able to hide behind this patina.
Mhm.
In many ways, that's being stripped away. So if all you're left with is Project 2025, how do we differentiate ourselves from some of the really bad authoritarian regimes that have wreaked havoc over the last century, longer?
Mhm. The patina thing I think is a very interesting metaphor, which maybe isn't even metaphorical. But when China is obviously a consistent subject through
Yeah,
most of the chapters, but what is
they're
interesting is
really
like,
paranoid about China, aren't they?
yeah, yeah.
I,
But
they're
China
terrified.
has positioned itself as a developing country because of its communism status, but it is also trying to position itself as a near Arctic state, which is where the Greenland
Yeah,
weirdness comes up. If you're not paying attention, Greenland seems like somebody spun a globe and decided to buy a island. But because of climate change, not that they believe in climate change, the ice shelf is melting. And so more and more land is becoming available, and there's natural resources there.
yeah,
And so if China is deemed an Arctic state, Canada is deemed an Arctic state, the United States is because of Alaska, and then obviously the Soviet Union. Um, Greenland is also an Arctic state, right? Like I
yep.
feel like that's the motivation. And this is what I mean is that when I hear these things and I'm just like, this is gloopesty. Like what on earth is happening? There is actually a reason, and my lack of knowing what that reason is my responsibility, which is why I feel obligated to do this whole project to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Greenland is an interesting case, and it plays to Trump's strengths.
Mhm. Yeah,
Oh,
there's
that's the craziest thing in the world. That guy is just nuts. No, actually, there is a
yeah.
bit of strategy to that. There is a world in which it makes sense. I frankly think the answer is to negotiate with Denmark to
Mm,
see if we can't meet some more of our needs. I don't think we need to threaten to buy Greenland or take back the Panama Canal.
right. There's a term in here that I'm curious to see what your thoughts are because I'm not gonna lie, it made me panic. But the idea of Article 10 rehemisphering, like
Yeah,
about like
I'm,
shaking up rules. The
yeah,
idea that you can just, yeah, we're not gonna play by those rules anymore. Like just refix it. I don't know. I don't think refix it means in like a physics sense of a sphere, but what is considered a northern power versus a southern power, um, that does seem to be kind of happening because of the alliances. And
Well,
maybe
it is.
planisphering is metaphorical and not literal because it's a sphere, although some people also question that. But realigning who's on whose team without hopefully going to world war. That's how I interpreted it. What do you think?
Yeah, it is. And I'm not sure I understand all about Article 10. It, like so much of this, where it scares the willies out of me is when you think of it in the larger context. So, the United States, World War II ended. Arguably, we colonized Europe as a result of that. We did so peacefully. Then we got involved in Vietnam. That was a hell of a mess. So we decided let's not have any more overt wars. Let's do
Only
what we've been
passive
doing.
wars
Let's
because we
do what
don't
we've been
declare
doing
war.
in Central America for
Mhm.
years. Let's have these covert actions, and we invented the special forces.
Mhm.
Used to be our heroes were Green Berets. Now it's special forces. How many TV shows do you want to talk about? But that's all covert military action. And now these people are saying, forget about the window dressing. Let's just go take it. We got the biggest military on earth. Why aren't we using it? That's the attitude that permeates chapter 6.
Mhm. If there's a Venn diagram between energy products, manufacturing, and local security concerns, that's where the power gets redistributed as to who we're aligning with and who we're not aligning
Yeah,
with. Not history, not treaties, not agreements, not precedent, but again, really centering money. Um,
right. And yet we're indignant, now that we've been shown to be naked, we're indignant that, oh my God, Russia's going to actually work with North Korea in the Ukraine. How dare they do that? And China might have actual interests in other parts of the world. How dare that? That's our area. Why do they think they can get away?
right.
It's
Is
silly.
you can have your cake and eat it too if you work at the Heritage Foundation.
Yeah, apparently.
Yeah. Okay, couple other shout outs. Department of Energy pulls in the Department of State and came up with the idea of energy reparations. I'm not gonna lie, I'm kind of excited that the word reparations is in the document. Um, but the idea being that for countries that pollute more than the United States, they should be paying more. And like a flat tax based on pollution, which sounds to me like you're considering climate change. Um, Also, the Department of Energy, that's where the Arctic development comes in. This chapter also talks about um, visa reciprocity or sanctions and using visas, which we already have heard in the news just
Yeah,
recently, but using them as leverages or weaponizing visas. That is actually already happening. Not just for immigrants and refugees welfare, but for like anybody that we need to like yank pull. Uh,
yeah.
that's fascinating. That includes F student visas as well as J exchange visas. Just toying with it. Sure, why not? Um, the the I'm laughing because there's something really cyclical about when you're so conservative that you are supporting an anti-fascist agenda. When conservatives don't like Antifa, which they made up, and
Yeah,
people who have embraced Antifa don't like the conservatives. Day one, drop out of the IMF, drop out of the WHO, UN, NATO, the Geneva consensus, anything related to international development or cyber or public diplomacy. Interestingly, y'all are agreeing with each other, but different motivations. But that was funny.
well, there's no shortage of hypocrisy in this thing. And thank you for being all optimistic and stuff. Yes, they are implicitly acknowledging that climate change is a reality.
Only on that sentence though.
I guess that's the good that comes from it. Um, but yes, and yes, the idea of reparations, that they actually use that word.
Mhm.
But I don't know how, so we were, environmentally speaking, we were as dirty as we wanted to be for 150 years as we industrialized. China's behind us on that timeline, so we're going to penalize them now?
Yes.
Gosh, that sounds a lot like economic imperialism to me.
Well, we're gonna call it something different. But yes. Um,
And yet, and yet we want to buy all your cheap stuff. Oh, but wait, we're going to put a tariff on that.
right. Except for batteries for electric vehicles or autonomous vehicles, which are also mentioned, which also does not the sentence about intentionally increasing our dependence on fossil fuels is in the same chapter, Department of Energy, same chapter about focusing on electric vehicles and autonomous driving cars.
Yeah,
I don't understand, but
yeah.
okay.
I mean, I think if you boiled this whole thing away, it's about wealth,
Mhm. And
that pure economic
if we
wealth.
take wealth and that kind of quote rehemisphering,
Yeah.
focusing on Iran, Venezuela, Russia, North Korea, and China as the bad guys that we need to be more bad than. That's what it seems to be. We're not trying to fix them and we're not trying to align with them. We're trying to be more bad than them. That's that I wasn't
Well,
into.
and how do we have that conversation? For
Mhm,
goodness sakes, objectively, we are the greatest economy on earth,
mhm.
largely because for about 200 years, we built wealth based on enslaved labor.
Right. Worked out great.
And then when that ended, we went out and stole the land from a bunch of people who already lived there and stripped their natural resources and continued to get richer. And when that didn't work out, when we depleted that, then we went down to Central and South America and took over their governments and got cheap bananas if we can't even talk about the history of the United States, who we are, then I don't know how you counter these.
I do not disagree with you. But here is what's interesting. So, as I have been doing these chapters, and again, I recognize I am an optimistic, hopeful person, which is not
I
anticipated
know, that's
doing
so
this.
cute. I'm the relentless optimist.
It's adorable. Um, what do we do about this, right? So, like, a lot of these topics are way outside of, I think, a typical person's scope of power while they're eating a TV dinner, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you have thoughts or ideas about even just concepts that we're talking about. And so I want to focus on this kind of what structure. So this is a discussion question, right?
Yeah.
What structures do you fundamentally follow and believe in because you don't think they will shift? And just
Yeah.
practicing your dependence on their stability, I think is going to be helpful because some of these things are going to come into question.
I,
What are your thoughts?
I think, well, the fundamental structure I believe in is democracy.
Mm-hmm.
I do not, I reject the idea that the majority is always right. They're not, but the majority does rule. That's the way it works.
Mm-hmm.
That's the best way for it to work out of all the other configurations I could imagine. I really want the majority to rule. That means I have an obligation to get involved and stay involved. And as I said before, that's the mistake liberals have always made. We assume the game's over and it's not. So how does that play out? I think us us liberals need to stay involved at the very most local level.
Mm-hmm.
We need to quit virtue signaling and fighting with one another over small issues. Uh, let's keep an eye on the very big picture. So here in Rochester, we just had city council elections, and because of the timing, a majority of the city council is up for election. There's a group called the Isaiah Project. I think they have a national presence, but they're very church-based. And they, for the first time, our city council is nonpartisan. They organized campaigning, canvassing, door to door. Now, I don't agree with the Isaiah Project because they're very, very church-based and they don't hide from that. But I was happy to work with them. The other side said, oh my God, the socialists from the Twin Cities are taking over our pristine, nonpartisan city council here.
Hmm.
Well, be ready for that. They're going to react that way. In the end, it was a pretty good outcome. We have our first openly gay mayor here in Rochester, Minnesota, as a result of the work of the Isaiah Project.
Hmm.
And the city council does have its hands on the levers of important things that happen locally.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a pretty good local school board. They're dealing with some issues in the school district. We've also got an extreme MAGA Republican as our congressman.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take it to the next step now. Let's work in the district. That means leaving the confines of the city of Rochester and going out and talking to some of our neighbors who are flying Trump flags and even QAnon flags in their front yard. But we're going to have to engage with those people and
Right.
talk to them about it.
I think there's a
And
theme.
it's tiring, you know, I
Yeah.
got plenty of other things to do, but
I have so many other things to do, and it's hard to like engage when everything else is telling you you don't have to do this. Like just write them off, kick them
right.
off the island. But I have said this for years, but it seems to be even more important. But coexistence shouldn't be a goal. But sometimes I think we have to back up enough to realize that it needs to be a goal because we need to remember that we are already coexisting. And
Yeah,
those are your neighbors. Those are
yeah.
your family members. Like, yeah, you gotta figure out how to do it. And
So instead of saying to my neighbor, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, what an idiot you are, I need to be better about saying, why do you think that?
mhm,
Why do you think that there's such a thing as vaccine shedding
mm,
and that people who get the COVID vaccine need to be quarantined for 2 weeks, otherwise they will infect others? Tell me why
interesting.
you think that's true. Let me show
Mhm.
you what I've read, instead of saying you're just a conspiracy theorist.
There is an interesting TikTok, and we'll have to wrap up on this part, but there was an interesting TikTok I saw the other day, speaking of China. And a woman was like, okay, this is for like liberal people out there. If you can show me real journalism that's not on television and it's not one of the publicly owned newspapers that I've heard about, etc., but show me real journalism that tells the story of, and then insert what I would call conspiracy theories, right? Like Hunter Biden, Joe Biden,
Yeah,
Hillary Clinton, like the usual tropes, right? But why can't you show me evidence in real journalism? And I realized we're screwed because real journalism is going to be listed as like media performance.
yeah,
And the media performance is deeply rooted to capitalism, obviously. But at the same time, you actually have, you know, Fox News don't identify as journalists, they identify as media performers.
yeah.
And they're not breaking the rules. They're not doing anything unethical because they don't promise you the news. They're a show about the news, and they're a show about the news that is set to a specific agenda.
Yes,
So
that's right. And there
again,
was a time when, in order to maintain your broadcast license, you had to periodically show that you were serving the public interest.
mhm.
You know what else? There was a time many years ago at the turn of the century that in order to maintain a corporate charter, you had to show that your charter served a public interest.
Oh, that's gone.
Think about how that would work out if, in order to remain a corporation, you had to prove you were serving the public interest, not shareholder value.
Well, interestingly, that one of the biggest pieces that's being shifted is not accepting the change of focusing between shareholders and stakeholders, which goes from Milton Friedman to Freeman. But the idea that we're embracing that the only job of an organization is to increase return on investment for shareholders. That is their only responsibility, which has been a functional definition for decades. But
Yeah,
the shift to paying attention to the impact as well as the potential of what a corporation could do with the resources that they have. I mean, that started in the 80s. It's not brand new, but it is
So what we're getting to, and
wanting to be rolled back.
I'm watching the time too. Here, I think, is the fundamental question that scares the daylights out of everybody.
Mm.
Does capitalism always produce the best results?
It's a great question. We should talk about
That seems to be our operating theory.
it.
The profit motive will always produce the best results. Oh,
Well,
except maybe when it comes to insuring your house in Southern California, or maybe when it comes to healthcare, or perhaps food, or maybe energy. Maybe the
or
selfish
the
profit motive doesn't produce the best results. Well, then what?
privatization of nuclear waste disposal. That is
Yeah,
keeping me awake at night.
yeah.
Um, well,
So
Craig, as,
but if we allow for the possibility that maybe capitalism isn't the best system, then we're going to have to figure out where we regulate it, and that's where they go
right,
nuts.
well, we don't want any regulations. That's the
Right.
easy thing. As usual, I love talking to you, and I love your brain, and I love your heart, and you're one of my favoriteest friends ever. So thank you very much for this very thought-provoking conversation. I'm going to make more coffee and think some more. Um,
I
thank
will
you.
send you a couple of those books that I mentioned.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. I'll put them in the show notes.
Fascinating time.
Excellent. Thanks, Craig.
Okay, thanks, Jess.